600 feet down in the Canadian Arctic, something sits in the ice-cold darkness that shouldn't exist anymore. September 2014. Parks Canada's sonar detected a large object on the seafloor of Queen Maud Gulf. When the ROV descended through the frigid water, what it found made maritime archaeologists stop breathing. HMS Erebus, sitting upright on the Arctic seabed, remarkably intact after 166 years. The ship that had carried some of Britain's best officers and sailors into the ice in 1845, never to return. But Erebus was only half the story. 2 years later, in 2016, they found HMS Terror 800 kilometers away in Terror Bay. And what these wrecks revealed about the Franklin expedition's final days is far more horrifying than anyone imagined. Because for 150 years, the British Admiralty dismissed Inuit testimony about what they'd seen. Stories about starving white men dragging boats across the ice, reports of bodies with strange cuts, whispers of something unspeakable happening as 129 men slowly died in the Arctic darkness. The wrecks confirmed what the Inuit had been saying all along. This wasn't just a story of ships trapped in ice, this was a story of hubris, of Victorian pride meeting Arctic reality, and of desperate men reduced to the unthinkable as they fought to survive in one of Earth's most hostile environments. To understand why finding Erebus and Terror matters, you need to understand what the Franklin expedition represented in 1845. It wasn't just another Arctic voyage. It was Britain's final attempt to solve a 300-year-old mystery that had obsessed explorers since the 1500s. The Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Every European power wanted to find it because whoever controlled that route would dominate global trade. Hundreds of expeditions had tried. Most failed. Many died. But Britain in 1845 was at the height of its imperial power. The Royal Navy was the most advanced maritime force on Earth. British ships had mapped coastlines on every continent. British technology, steam engines and iron hulls, seemed capable of conquering any obstacle. The Admiralty decided to send one final definitive expedition that would succeed where all others had failed. They chose Sir John Franklin to command. Franklin was 59 years old, overweight, and hadn't been on an Arctic expedition in years. But he was well connected, titled, and had Arctic experience from earlier voyages in the 1820s. More importantly, he was expendable enough that his potential death wouldn't embarrass anyone important, but prestigious enough that his success would bring glory to the crown. The Admiralty gave Franklin 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These weren't ordinary vessels. They were bomb ships, originally designed to withstand the recoil of massive mortars. Their hulls were reinforced with extra planking. They'd been fitted with railway locomotive engines that could drive them at 4 knots under steam power, revolutionary for Arctic exploration. They'd been equipped with the latest technology, central heating systems using hot water pipes, desalination equipment to produce fresh water, libraries containing over 1,200 books, a hand organ that played 50 tunes. These ships represented the pinnacle of Victorian engineering and confidence. The expedition carried provisions for 3 years, tinned food, a relatively new preservation technology, salted meat, flour, tea, tobacco, rum, everything 129 men would need to survive years in the Arctic. They carried equipment for scientific research, magnetic instruments, surveying tools, specimen, collection materials. This wasn't just exploration. This was science. The crew was handpicked, officers from good families, experienced sailors, engineers to maintain the steam engines, a photographer with the latest daguerreotype equipment, even an ice master, a whaling captain named James Reed, who knew Arctic ice better than anyone. On May 19, 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror departed England. Crowds gathered to watch them sail. Newspapers praised the expedition. The Admiralty was confident. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, gave him a silk Union Jack to plant at the completion of the Northwest Passage. Nobody doubted they would succeed. Nobody imagined that every single man aboard both ships would be dead within 5 years, and that it would take 169 years to find out what happened to them. The last confirmed sighting of the Franklin expedition came in July 1845. The whaling ships Prince of Wales and Enterprise encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay, waiting for ice conditions to improve before entering Lancaster Sound. The crews appeared in good spirits. The ships were in excellent condition. Franklin sent letters home with the whalers, confident messages about progress and prospects. Then they sailed into Lancaster Sound, into the maze of ice-choked channels that make up the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And they vanished. For the first 2 years, nobody worried. Arctic expeditions routinely went years without contact. The ships carried 3 years of provisions. Franklin had orders to explore, to conduct scientific research, to map coastlines. Silence was expected, but by 1847 concern began to grow. Lady Jane Franklin pressured the Admiralty to send search expeditions. The Navy, embarrassed by the attention, finally agreed. Between 1848 and 1859, over 30 expeditions searched for Franklin. They found nothing. No ships, no men, no messages. The Arctic had swallowed 129 souls without a trace. Then, in 1850, the first clues appeared. Captain Erasmus Omni found the expedition's winter camp on Beechey Island. 3 graves marked with wooden headboards. John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. All dead in 1846, the first winter. But no other evidence. No messages explaining what happened. No indication of which direction the ships had gone. The graves raised more questions than answers. Why had 3 men died that first winter? What had killed them? And where were the other 126 men? In 1854, explorer John Ray encountered Inuit near King William Island who told him disturbing stories. White men, starving and desperate, dragging boats across the ice. Several years earlier, bodies found along the coast. Artifacts from the expedition, silver forks and spoons, in Inuit possession. And something else. Evidence that some of the bodies had been mutilated. Cut marks on bones. Ray's report included the word that Victorian Britain couldn't accept: cannibalism. The Admiralty was outraged. The British press attacked Ray viciously. How dare he suggest that British officers and gentlemen would engage in such savagery? Charles Dickens wrote articles defending Franklin's honor, insisting the Inuit were lying, that they had probably killed and eaten the explorers themselves. Lady Jane Franklin spent the rest of her life and fortune funding expeditions to clear her husband's name. The official narrative became that Franklin and his men had died heroically, probably from scurvy or starvation, attempting to complete their mission. The cannibalism allegations were dismissed as Inuit lies or misunderstandings, but the Inuit kept telling their stories. In the 1860s, explorer Charles Francis Hall interviewed Inuit on King William Island, who described finding many bodies, white men who had died on a long march south, some bodies inside an overturned boat, others scattered along the coastline. The Inuit described visiting the ships, one still afloat, one sunk in shallow water. They described taking items from the ships, metal and wood that was valuable in the treeless Arctic. They described seeing papers and books, which they couldn't read and had no use for, but British authorities didn't listen. Indigenous testimony wasn't considered reliable. The official searches continued to focus on the wrong areas, looking for a triumphant completion of the Northwest Passage rather than a desperate retreat south. In 1879, Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka led an expedition that found more remains on King William Island, bones scattered across the landscape, evidence of a death march. But still no ships. The Arctic ice had claimed Erebus and Terror completely. For 135 years after that, the Franklin expedition remained one of history's greatest mysteries. Dozens of theories emerged. Some claimed the ships had been crushed by ice. Others suggested they'd sailed into a dead end and become trapped. A few conspiracy theories proposed mutiny or even Russian interference. But nobody knew for certain because nobody could find the ships. Then, in 2008, Parks Canada launched a systematic search operation. Using modern technology, sonar, underwater robots, ice-capable research vessels, they began methodically surveying the waters around King William Island. They had one advantage previous searchers hadn't. They listened to the Inuit. Traditional knowledge passed down through generations described where the ships had been seen. These oral histories, dismissed by Victorian explorers, turned out to be remarkably accurate. On September 1, 2014, Parks Canada's sonar detected something in Queen Maud Gulf, south of King William Island. A large object sitting upright on the seafloor in about 36 feet of water. When the ROV descended with cameras, the images that came back were stunning. HMS Erebus, sitting perfectly upright on the Arctic seabed, her masts gone but the hull largely intact. You could see the deck layout, the steam engine housing, the propeller shaft. After 166 years in the Arctic, the ship looked like she'd been abandoned yesterday. The cold water and low oxygen had preserved her remarkably. The discovery made international headlines. The mystery of Franklin's ships had finally been solved. Except it was only half solved. Where was HMS Terror? The assumption was that Terror couldn't be far from Erebus. They'd been sister ships, presumably trapped in the same ice. Search teams focused on the area around Queen Maud Gulf. They found nothing. Terror Bay, 800 kilometers to the north, had been named by explorers who'd heard Inuit reports of a ship there. But systematic searches of Terror Bay in the 1990s and 2000s had found nothing. Most experts assumed the Inuit had been describing Erebus, that the ship they'd seen wasn't actually in Terror Bay. Then, in September 2016, everything changed. A research vessel from the Arctic Research Foundation was conducting surveys in Terror Bay when their sonar picked up something impossible. A large ship-shaped object sitting upright on the seafloor in 79 feet of water. When they sent down the ROV, they found HMS Terror, not only found her but found her in the most remarkably preserved condition of any 19th century wreck ever discovered. Terror sat upright, completely intact. Hatches closed. Many artifacts still in place. The ship appeared to have been carefully abandoned, not wrecked. The crew had clearly left in an organized fashion, closing hatches behind them, securing the ship as if they intended to return. Inside the wreck, visible through portholes and hatches, artifacts remained in place. Plates on tables, bottles in storage, the ship's wheel still in position. It was like looking at a time capsule from 1848. The two discoveries, Erebus in 2014 and Terror in 2016, finally allowed archaeologists to piece together what had happened to the Franklin expedition, and the story was far worse than anyone had imagined. Here's what we know now from the wrecks, the bodies found over the years, and modern forensic analysis combined with Inuit testimony that was accurate all along. In September 1846, after successfully navigating through Lancaster Sound and down Peel Sound, Erebus and Terror became trapped in ice off the northwest coast of King William Island. This was normal. Arctic ships routinely spent winters frozen in ice, waiting for spring thaw. Franklin's crew settled in for what they thought would be a temporary delay. The ships were comfortable, heated, well provisioned. They conducted scientific observations. They performed plays. They waited for spring. But spring 1847 didn't bring release. The ice didn't melt. Arctic ice patterns are unpredictable. Some years channels open. Other years ice remains solid for multiple seasons. 1847 was a bad year. The ships remained trapped. On June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. The official record found later says he died but doesn't specify how. Age, illness, the stress of seeing his expedition trapped, we don't know. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier, commander of HMS Terror, and an experienced Arctic explorer. Crozier faced an impossible situation. Two ships trapped in ice with no sign of release. Provisions slowly depleting. Crew morale declining. And something else happening that nobody understood at the time. The men were being slowly poisoned. Modern analysis of bodies recovered from the Franklin expedition shows catastrophically high levels of lead. The source, the tinned food. Canning was new technology in the 1840s. The expedition's supplier had sealed thousands of cans using lead solder. As the food sat in the cans, lead leached into it. The crew was eating lead-contaminated food every day for years. Lead poisoning causes neurological damage, impaired judgment, paranoia, weakness. Some researchers believe lead poisoning contributed to bad decisions in the expedition's final year. By April 1848, the situation was desperate. The ships had been trapped for nearly 2 years. Provisions were running low. The crew was suffering from scurvy, vitamin C deficiency that causes teeth to fall out, wounds that won't heal, debilitating weakness. And the lead poisoning was making everything worse. On April 22, 1848, Captain Crozier made the decision to abandon the ships. He left a note in a cairn on King William Island, the only written record we have of the expedition's fate. The note, found years later, says that Franklin died in June 1847, that 24 men had died total by April 1848, that the remaining 105 survivors were abandoning the ships and marching south toward the Back River, hoping to reach a Hudson's Bay Company outpost over 1,000 miles away. It was a death sentence, and Crozier probably knew it. Marching over 1,000 miles across Arctic ice and tundra, dragging heavy boats and supplies, with crews already weakened by scurvy and lead poisoning, in one of the harshest environments on Earth, the survival odds were essentially zero. But staying with the ships meant certain death. At least the march offered the illusion of hope. So 105 men abandoned HMS Erebus and HMS Terror in April 1848 and started dragging boats south across King William Island. The archaeological evidence of what happened next is scattered across hundreds of miles of Arctic coastline. Bodies found in the 1850s through 1990s, bones with cut marks, artifacts abandoned along the route. The story they tell is of gradual disintegration. The march started organized. The men dragged boats loaded with supplies. But Arctic travel is brutally hard. The ice is rough, broken into pressure ridges that require constant climbing. The snow is deep. The weather is unpredictable. And the men were already weakened. They started abandoning equipment. Heavy items that slowed them down. Boats were left behind. Scientific instruments. Books. Personal items. The trail of discarded artifacts shows increasing desperation. They were trying to lighten their loads, to move faster, to reach salvation before their strength gave out completely. But it wasn't enough. Men started dying. At first, they were buried. Bodies found by later searchers show evidence of Christian burial, wrapped in fabric, laid out carefully. The crew was maintaining discipline, maintaining civilization. But as more men died, as the survivors grew weaker, the burials became less formal. Bodies left where they fell. By the time the survivors reached the southern coast of King William Island, discipline was breaking down completely. This is where the evidence becomes disturbing. This is where the Inuit testimony, dismissed for 150 years, was proven accurate. Bodies found along the southern coast show clear evidence of butchery. Cut marks on bones consistent with defleshing. Bones cracked open to access marrow. Skulls broken to access brains. Cooking pots found nearby contained human remains. The men of the Franklin expedition, officers and gentlemen of the Royal Navy, had resorted to cannibalism. Modern forensic analysis leaves no doubt. They were eating their dead to stay alive. Victorian Britain couldn't accept this. Charles Dickens and others insisted it was impossible, that British officers would die before engaging in such savagery. But the physical evidence is unambiguous. Desperate men, starving, poisoned by lead, suffering from scurvy, reduced to the most primal survival instinct, eating the dead to give the living a few more days. It didn't work. By 1850, all 129 men were dead. Nobody survived. Nobody reached the Hudson's Bay Company outpost. Nobody completed the Northwest Passage. Nobody went home. The Arctic claimed them all. But before we judge these men too harshly, we need to understand what they faced. Imagine being trapped on a ship in the ice for 2 years, watching your commander die, watching your friends die, feeling your own body slowly failing from scurvy and lead poisoning, your teeth falling out, your wounds not healing, your mind becoming confused from the lead, then being told to abandon the ship and march over 1,000 miles across ice to salvation, knowing you're probably going to die, but having no choice except to try. Now imagine weeks into that march, half your companions are dead. You're so weak you can barely stand. You haven't eaten real food in days. Your body is consuming itself, and there are bodies around you. Meat, protein, the thing your body desperately needs. At what point does survival instinct override civilization? At what point do you make that choice? We'd like to think we'd choose death over cannibalism. But we're not starving in the Arctic. We're not poisoned and desperate. The men of the Franklin expedition made the choices they had to make to survive a few days longer. It just wasn't enough. The discoveries of Erebus and Terror tell us something else important. The Inuit were right about everything. They said the ships were abandoned but intact. Correct. They said one ship was in Queen Maud Gulf area. Correct. They said another ship was far north in Terror Bay. Correct. They said the crews died on a long march south. Correct. They said some of the dead had been butchered. Correct. For 150 years British authorities dismissed this testimony as unreliable. Indigenous people couldn't possibly have accurate information. Their stories were legends, not facts. Except they weren't legends. They were eyewitness accounts. Inuit hunters had found the ships, had boarded them, had seen the bodies, had observed what happened. They told British explorers exactly where to look, and those explorers, confident in their superior European knowledge, looked everywhere except where the Inuit said. It took 169 years and modern technology before anyone thought to listen to the indigenous testimony. And when they finally did, they found everything exactly where the Inuit had said it would be. The condition of the wrecks tells us about the crew's final days. Erebus shows signs of having been occupied longer. There's evidence of salvage work, materials removed to support the men on their march. She may have remained accessible to survivors for some time after the initial abandonment. Terror's remarkable preservation, hatches closed, artifacts in place, suggests a more organized abandonment. The crew left carefully, securing the ship, perhaps hoping to return if the ice situation changed. Neither hope was realistic, but maintaining discipline, maintaining the rituals of naval procedure, probably helped the men psychologically in those final days. The wrecks are now protected as underwater archaeological sites and war graves. Canada has conducted limited exploration, sending ROVs to document the sites but not recovering artifacts. The bodies of most of the 129 men are scattered across King William Island and the surrounding waters. Some have been found and studied. Most remain where they died, frozen in the permafrost or buried under Arctic ice. The Franklin expedition represents one of the greatest disasters in exploration history, but it also represents something else: the collision of Victorian arrogance with Arctic reality. Britain sent its best ships, its most advanced technology, its confidence that European superiority could conquer any environment. The Arctic destroyed all of it. The steam engines couldn't break ice. The tinned food poisoned the crew. The heavy equipment became burdens. The Victorian certainty that civilization and technology would prevail proved catastrophically wrong. The Inuit, living in the Arctic for thousands of years, knew how to survive. They traveled light. They hunted fresh meat to avoid scurvy. They listened to the land. They adapted. If Franklin had consulted Inuit hunters, instead of dismissing them as savages, if he'd adopted indigenous survival techniques, instead of relying on British technology, maybe some of his men would have survived. But that wasn't the Victorian way. The Franklin expedition's failure says something profound about hubris, about what happens when pride meets reality, about the cost of dismissing indigenous knowledge, about the limits of technology without wisdom. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sit on the Arctic seabed today as monuments to that lesson. The ships that were supposed to prove British superiority instead proved that nature doesn't care about your technology or your empire or your confidence. The Arctic killed 129 men not because they lacked courage or equipment. It killed them because they refused to respect its power. Today, climate change is melting the Arctic ice that trapped Franklin. Ironically, the Northwest Passage that killed 129 men seeking it is now opening due to global warming. Ships regularly transit the route that was impossible in 1845. The Arctic that seemed unconquerable is being conquered not by exploration but by the slow catastrophe of rising temperatures. In 50 years there may be no ice at all in the passage Franklin died seeking. The discoveries of Erebus and Terror remind us that exploration isn't just about going somewhere first. It's about respecting the places you go, about learning from the people who already live there, about understanding that technology alone isn't enough when facing environments that can kill you in minutes. 129 men died because Victorian Britain believed European knowledge was superior to indigenous wisdom, because they trusted tinned food more than fresh meat, because they brought a library of books instead of learning to hunt, because pride mattered more than survival. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror are the grave markers for that pride, and 129 men remain in the Arctic, testimony to the cost of arrogance.